The afternoon Claire Sullivan asked him to teach her how to drive, Marcus Reed realized that some people spend their whole lives preparing for moments they never see coming. Marcus was 38, a trim carpenter who ran a small restoration shop out of a converted garage on the east side of town. He worked mostly alone, fixing broken furniture that people couldn't bear to throw away, and building custom shelves for kitchens that needed more warmth than the big box stores could provide. He'd been divorced 3 years earlier from a woman who loved the idea of a craftsman until she realized craftsmanship meant sawdust on his jeans and weekends spent matching wood grain instead of attending brunch. The split had been quiet, almost polite, and he'd come out of it with a paid-off truck, a lease on the shop, and a habit of saying yes when people asked him for help because it was easier than explaining why he preferred to work alone. Claire was his best friend's older sister. She was 41, recently divorced herself, and had just moved back to town after 15 years in Chicago, managing a legal archive for a firm that treated her like expensive furniture. She had dark hair that she wore clipped up in a way that suggested she'd stopped caring whether it looked good, and only cared whether it stayed out of her face, sharp green eyes, and a tendency to say exactly what she meant in fewer words than most people needed. Marcus had known her peripherally for years through her younger brother Danny, but they'd never spent real time alone until the morning she showed up at his shop, wearing jeans with paint on the knee, and asked if he had 20 minutes to look at a table hinge that kept catching. He'd fixed the hinge. She'd bought him coffee. 3 weeks later, she called and asked if he'd teach her to drive. "You're 41, Marcus said, standing in his driveway with his phone wedged against his shoulder while he wiped varnish off his hands. "You're telling me you never learned?" "I lived in Chicago," Claire said. "I took the train. I took cabs. I walked. Now I'm back here and everyone acts like not driving makes me an alien." "It kind of does. So will you help me or not?" Marcus looked at the sky. It was late September, the kind of afternoon where the light turned everything gold and the air smelled like cut grass and distant wood smoke. He thought about saying no. He thought about all the reasons it made sense to say no. Then he said, "Yeah, Saturday morning, bring coffee." She showed up at 9 with 2 paper cups and an expression that made it clear she was already regretting asking. They started in the empty parking lot behind the shuttered grocery store on Maple, the same lot where Marcus had learned to drive 22 years earlier. Claire gripped the wheel like it might try to escape. Her posture was so rigid he could see the tension in her shoulders through her jacket. "You're not defusing a bomb," Marcus said, leaning against the passenger door with his coffee balanced on his knee. "It's just a truck. It's a truck that weighs 2 tons and could kill someone if I sneeze wrong." "Then don't sneeze." She shot him a look. It was the first time he'd seen her smile that morning, and it softened something in her face that he hadn't realized was tight. She put the truck in drive. It lurched forward 6 inches and stalled. She swore under her breath, restarted it, and tried again. This time it rolled smoothly across the cracked asphalt, slow and steady, like a barge crossing a harbor. They practiced for an hour. Straight lines, wide turns, parking between faded yellow lines that had been painted when the grocery store still sold produce. Claire didn't talk much while she drove, but when she did, her observations were precise and funny in a way that caught Marcus off guard. She called the turn signal a clicking guilt machine. She said the rearview mirror made her feel like she was being followed by her own mistakes. When she finally parallel parked between 2 orange cones without hitting either one, she looked over at him and said, "That felt like surgery." "Good surgery or bad surgery?" "The kind where you survive, but you're not sure you should try it again." Marcus laughed. It surprised him. He hadn't laughed that easily in months. They kept meeting. Every Saturday morning, same parking lot, same 2 cups of coffee. Claire got better quickly. She stopped gripping the wheel like it owed her money. She learned to check her mirrors without moving her whole head. By the 4th week, she was confident enough to leave the parking lot and practice on actual streets, the quiet residential blocks where the speed limit was 25 and the only real danger was a dog off its leash. It was during one of those drives on a tree-lined street with houses that all had porch swings and mailboxes shaped like barns that Claire said, "Can I ask you something?" Marcus glanced over. She was focused on the road, both hands at 10 and 2, her expression unreadable. "After 4 weeks of this, I feel like you've earned it. Why'd you say yes?" He didn't answer right away. A leaf drifted across the windshield, gold and papery, and caught in the wiper. "Danny asked me to," Marcus said finally. "Said you'd been back a month and hadn't left the house except for groceries? Thought it might help." Claire was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He worries too much." "He's your brother?" "It's in the job description." "Still." She slowed for a stop sign, came to a complete stop, checked both ways even though the street was empty. "I didn't need saving. I just needed to stop feeling like I couldn't do normal things anymore." "Is that what this is? A normal thing?" She looked over at him then, just for a second, and something in her expression had shifted. "I don't know yet," she said. They kept driving. The trouble started 3 weeks later at Danny's backyard barbecue. It was one of those October evenings where the air had just enough chill to make the fire pit feel necessary, and the sky was the kind of deep blue that only happened right before dark. Danny had invited half the neighborhood, and the yard was full of people holding beers and paper plates, talking over each other in the easy way people did when they'd known each other too long to bother with formalities. Marcus showed up late, still wearing his work boots, and found Claire standing near the fence with a glass of wine in one hand and an expression that suggested she was counting the minutes until she could leave. She saw him and her whole face changed. "Thank God," she said. "I've been cornered twice already by people who want to know why I'm not dating." "What did you tell them?" "That I'm recently divorced and not interested in being set up with their cousin who works in insurance and loves jet skis." Marcus grinned. Solid answer. They stood together by the fence, not talking much, just watching the party unfold around them. It felt comfortable in a way Marcus hadn't expected. Comfortable enough that when Danny's wife Laura came over with a knowing smile and said, "You two look cozy," Marcus didn't feel the need to correct her. But someone else did. His name was Nathan Cross, and he was Claire's ex-husband. He'd driven in from Chicago for the weekend to pick up the last of his things from the storage unit Claire's parents still kept in their garage, and Danny, in a staggering miscalculation of social dynamics, had invited him to the barbecue under the mistaken belief that everyone was adult enough to handle it. Nathan was tall, expensively dressed in the kind of casual clothes that only looked casual because they cost $300, and had the calm, controlled voice of a man who'd spent 15 years winning arguments in conference rooms. He walked up to Claire and Marcus with a beer in his hand and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Claire," he said, "didn't expect to see you here. It's my brother's house, Nathan." "Right. Of course." He glanced at Marcus, then back at Claire. "And who's this?" "Marcus Reed," Marcus said, offering his hand. "I'm a friend of Danny's." Nathan shook his hand, but his grip was just slightly too firm, just slightly too long. "Nathan Cross. Claire's husband?" "Ex-husband," Claire said quietly. "Technically," Nathan said, and his smile sharpened, "though the paperwork only finalized 2 months ago, so forgive me if I'm still adjusting." There was a pause, the kind of pause where everyone nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Marcus could feel the attention shifting toward them like a spotlight swinging across a stage. "Well," Marcus said evenly, "nice to meet you." He started to turn away, but Nathan wasn't finished. "So how do you two know each other?" Nathan asked, his tone light, conversational, the kind of tone that made the question feel like a trap. Claire stiffened. Marcus saw it in the way her shoulders pulled back, the way her fingers tightened slightly around her glass. He also saw the exact moment she decided she wasn't going to let Nathan control the narrative. "Marcus has been teaching me to drive," Claire said. Nathan blinked. Then he laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound, the kind of laugh meant to make someone feel small. "You're learning to drive? At 41? "That's right." "Why didn't you just ask me?" "I offered a dozen times." "You offered to pay for lessons, Nathan." "That's not the same thing." "Because I thought you'd be more comfortable with a professional." Claire's jaw tightened. Marcus could see the argument building, could see the exact shape it was going to take, and he knew from experience that arguments like this never ended well in public. So he stepped in. "She's doing great," Marcus said, his voice calm and firm. "Better than most people I've seen. Takes it seriously. Doesn't rush. Listens. That's rarer than you'd think." Nathan looked at him, and for just a second the polished mask slipped. There was something sharp underneath, something that didn't like being interrupted. "I'm sure she appreciates the help," Nathan said, "though I have to say it's a little unusual. Grown woman, accomplished career, learning to drive from her brother's carpenter friend in a grocery store parking lot." The words landed exactly the way Nathan intended them to. Dismissive, condescending, designed to make Marcus feel like he was playing a role he hadn't earned. Marcus didn't flinch. He just looked at Nathan, steady and unhurried, and said, "Funny. I always thought the unusual part was spending 15 years with someone and never bothering to teach them something they needed." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Nathan's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened around his beer bottle. Claire was staring at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. Danny, standing near the grill, looked like he wanted to disappear into the smoke. Then Nathan smiled again, cold and tight. "Enjoy your evening," he said, and walked away. Claire didn't say anything for a long moment. When she finally did, her voice was quiet. "You didn't have to do that." "I know. He's going to make it a thing." "Let him." She looked up at Marcus, and he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not gratitude exactly, something closer to recognition. "Come on," she said. "Let's get out of here." They left the party together, walking down the driveway and onto the quiet street beyond. The air was cool now, and the stars were starting to come out. Neither of them spoke until they reached Marcus's truck, parked 3 houses down under a street lamp that flickered every few seconds. "I'm sorry," Claire said, leaning against the passenger door. "I didn't know he'd be there." "Not your fault." "Still, you didn't sign up for that." Marcus shrugged. "I signed up to teach you how to drive. Everything else is just context." She smiled at that. A real smile, not the careful one she wore around other people. "You're good at that, you know." "At what?" saying the thing that makes people feel like they're not a problem. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. The street lamp flickered again. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and stopped. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said. "You've earned it. Why are you really doing this? And don't say because Danny asked. I know my brother. He asked because he worries, but you kept showing up. That's different." Marcus looked at her. She was standing close enough that he could see the small scar above her left eyebrow, the faint freckles across the bridge of her nose that makeup usually covered. He thought about lying. He thought about deflecting. Then he thought about the way she'd looked at him back at the barbecue, like she saw something in him that most people missed. "Because you reminded me what it looks like when someone's trying," he said. "And I liked being part of that." Claire didn't look away. She didn't smile. She just held his gaze, steady and clear, and said, "Good, because I'm not done yet." 2 weeks later, Claire passed her driver's test on the first try. She called Marcus from the DMV parking lot, her voice bright with something that sounded like disbelief. He met her at the diner on 4th Street, the one with the mismatched chairs and the laminated menus that warned you about the salsa. She was already sitting in a booth when he arrived, grinning like she'd won something. "Congratulations," Marcus said, sliding into the seat across from her. "I parallel parked perfectly. The guy said it was the cleanest one he'd seen all week." "Of course it was. You practiced it 40 times. 52, Claire said. I counted. They ordered coffee. Claire ordered pie. She talked about the test, about the examiner who looked like he hated his job, about the teenage girl in the waiting room who'd failed twice and cried on her mother's shoulder. She talked more than Marcus had ever heard her talk, and he realized halfway through that she was happy, genuinely uncomplicatedly happy. It made something shift in his chest. When the pie came, she pushed the plate toward the center of the table and handed him a fork. They ate in comfortable silence for a minute. Then Claire said, "So what now?" "What do you mean?" "We've been meeting every Saturday for 2 months. I don't need lessons anymore. So what happens now?" Marcus looked at her. She was watching him carefully, her expression open but guarded, like she was bracing for an answer she didn't want to hear. "I don't know," he said honestly. "What do you want to happen?" Claire set her fork down. She looked at the pie, at the table, at the window where the late afternoon light was turning everything amber. Then she looked back at him. "I want to keep seeing you," she said. "But not as a teacher. Not as my brother's friend doing me a favor. As something else." Marcus felt his heart kick once hard against his ribs. "Claire, I know it's complicated," she said quickly. "I know Danny might be weird about it. I know Nathan would absolutely lose his mind if he found out. And I know you didn't ask for any of this. But I also know that the best part of my week has been sitting in a parking lot with you drinking bad coffee and listening to you explain the difference between oak and maple like it's the most important thing in the world. And I don't want to stop." She stopped, took a breath. Her hands were folded on the table, and Marcus saw that they were shaking slightly. "So," she said, "what do you think?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He thought about all the reasons this could go wrong. He thought about the divorce that was still too fresh, the ex-husband who clearly wasn't done making trouble, the fact that Danny would probably be furious and confused in equal measure. He thought about how easy it would be to say no, to keep things simple, to protect himself from the risk of getting hurt again. Then he thought about the way Claire looked at him when she laughed, the way she said his name, the way she'd pulled over 2 weeks ago on a quiet street and told him she wasn't made of glass. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "that I'd like that." Claire's whole face changed. The guardedness dropped away, and what was left was something so open and undefended that Marcus felt like he was seeing her for the first time. "Yeah?" she said. "Yeah." She reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, and her grip was steady. And Marcus realized in that moment that sometimes the thing you'd been preparing for your whole life was just the courage to say yes when someone asked you to stay. They sat there for a long time, holding hands across a table in a diner that smelled like coffee and frying onions, while the light outside turned gold and then amber and then the deep blue of early evening. When they finally left, Claire drove them both home in Marcus's truck, and she didn't stall once. 6 months later, Marcus rebuilt the table he'd fixed the hinge on and gave it to Claire as a gift. She put it in the kitchen of the house they'd just moved into together, a small craftsman bungalow with a porch swing and a backyard big enough for a garden. Danny had been weird about it for exactly 2 weeks before admitting that he'd never seen his sister happier. Nathan had stopped calling after the 3rd time Claire told him firmly and clearly that she'd moved on. On a Saturday morning in late spring, Marcus woke up to find Claire sitting at that table with a cup of coffee and a small velvet box she'd hidden in the drawer where they kept the spare batteries. She slid it across to him without saying a word. Inside was a brass key on a simple chain. "What's this for?" Marcus asked. "The shop," Claire said. "I bought the building. You're not renting anymore." Marcus stared at her. "Claire, I know you'll try to pay me back," she said. "And I know you'll say it's too much. But you taught me how to drive, Marcus. You taught me how to start over. This is me teaching you that you don't have to do everything alone." He didn't argue. He just kissed her, and she kissed him back, and later that afternoon they drove out to the coast and walked along the beach until the sun set and the sky turned the color of lavender and smoke. The night he proposed, they were sitting on the back porch of the bungalow drinking beer and watching fireflies blink in the tall grass. Marcus didn't have a ring. He didn't have a speech. He just looked at Claire and said, "Marry me." She didn't hesitate. She just smiled and said, "I'd love that." They got married 6 months later in the backyard, under string lights and a sky full of stars. Danny officiated. There were 40 people there, none of whom were Nathan. The ceremony lasted 12 minutes. The dancing lasted until 2 in the morning. When someone asked Claire later what had changed her mind about love after everything she'd been through, she thought for a long moment, and then said, "I stopped waiting for someone to save me and started looking for someone who'd let me save myself." Marcus just happened to be standing there when I figured that out. And Marcus, when asked the same question, said simply, "She taught me that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is just show up. Everything else is just details." So here's the question. What would you have done if someone asked you for help and it turned into the best decision you ever made? And have you ever had a moment where saying yes changed everything? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.